The Gamecocks have landed their first portal commit of the 2024 cycle in Coastal Carolina wide receiver Jared Brown, a guy that is reminiscent of a couple of former Gamecock star wideouts.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecock Digest over on SI.com. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions do apply. All right, so I know that coming out of the weekend that the mood was a bit sour in Gamecock Nation because South Carolina did not land any commits, at least as of late Sunday night. But that all changed on Monday afternoon as Coastal Carolina wide receiver Jared Brown announced his pledge to Shane Beamer and South Carolina. Brown was one of the official visitors for the Gamecocks this past weekend, and although he was planning on taking a couple more trips, one to Louisville halfway through this week and another one to Auburn this upcoming weekend, it appeared that the Gamecocks did more than enough on his visit that they were able to lock him down right afterwards. And in my opinion, that's a pretty good sign of how this past weekend went if you want to just use Jared Brown's visit to gauge all of that. And when looking at Jared Brown and what he's going to offer on the field for South Carolina, this is a guy that is going to be an instant plug-and-play starter for this football team. As a matter of fact, I'm confident enough in making this statement. If Jared Brown was on this roster in 2023 for this past season, I think he probably would have been the second best receiver on this roster, right behind Xavier Legette. Obviously, if you say Juice Wells is healthy, then he would probably be third on the roster. But Jared Brown, listen, do not let the fact that he is coming from Coastal Carolina fool you. We've talked about this several times. This is a highly productive wide receiver. He had around 1,500 career receiving yards up in Conway the past couple of years. He was a freshman All-American per multiple outlets in the 2022 season. And when you watch some of his footage, some of his game film from the 2023 season, Brown has got the perfect skill set for a slot wide receiver. He has got a great release off the line of scrimmage. He has got near track level speed. Not quite track level speed, but probably about 4.4 type speed. And he's also got good footwork when he's making cuts and breaks in his routes. Honestly, he reminds me a lot of former Gamecock wide receiver Shi Smith in terms of his overall build and what he can do from the slot. The only difference is I think that Brown is actually a touch more athletic than Shi Smith is. And I also think he's a guy that could do a little bit more from behind the line of scrimmage. And that leads me to my next point. There are a couple different things that are part of Jared Brown's makeup, both on the field and in terms of his intangibles, that in my opinion separates himself from all the other wide receivers at the group of five level. The first point that I want to get into here is he can be used in a variety of different ways. This is a guy that can run deep crossers for you. He can be used on slot fade routes, but he's also somebody that can be effective in the screen game behind the line of scrimmage. And he can also be utilized in the run game, whether it is jet sweeps, maybe a touch pass out of a jet motion, or he can even line up in the backfield. He did that out of the pistol formation a ton for Coastal Carolina this past season. And he actually recorded over 400 rushing yards during his time with the Chanticleers. So, Jared Brown, he is a dual threat in terms of what he can do offensively. In a lot of ways, he is an offensive weapon. Who does that sound like? That sounds like Deebo Samuel, who, by the way, is balling right now for the San Francisco 49ers in the NFL. Now, before people absolutely grill me about this comparison, I will go ahead and acknowledge Jared Brown does not have the same build as Deebo Samuel. That's what makes Deebo Samuel different from a lot of other wide receivers. He's a unicorn in the sense that he has a running back type build, but he has wide receiver skills. Jared Brown's not quite like that. But in terms of the way that he can affect a football game, he is quite similar to a guy like Deebo Samuel. The other thing that I want to touch on about Jared Brown, this has nothing to do with his skills on the field or any of his stats, but purely the way that he is as a competitor. I watched back a lot of the game footage from Coastal Carolina's game against Jacksonville State in the 2023 season to get an idea of what kind of receiver the Gamecocks were getting in Jared Brown. And the thing that I picked up on is that you can tell by the way that Jared Brown expresses himself, you can tell by the way that he sort of looks back for the football when he is running a route in the middle of a play. Jared Brown is the kind of wide receiver that wants the football. He does not shy away from being the primary target in his team's offense. Now, some people might interpret that as a negative because the stereotype when it comes to wide receivers is that wide receivers can be kind of like divas. They can be a bit selfish. They can be those kind of players that they literally always want the ball in their hands, but maybe not for the right reasons. I don't think Jared Brown is that kind of wide receiver. I think that he is a guy that he wants the ball in his hands almost on every play, but more so because he wants to make an impact for his team, because he has confidence in his abilities. And not every wide receiver has that. Some wide receivers have that killer instinct. Juice Wells, as much as I know Gamecock fans don't like him at this point with what's happened over the past few weeks, he's a wide receiver that has that kind of killer instinct when he's out there on the football field. There are other guys that don't have it. There are other guys that struggle with their confidence in terms of what they can do. Jared Brown, from the little bit that I watched, and it was a small sample size, but from what I saw, he is not going to have that kind of problem. And that is something that can help a guy like him going from the Sun Belt Conference into the SEC. Is Jared Brown going to be a 1,000-yard plus wide receiver for South Carolina this next season? I don't think so. But this is a humongous pickup for Shane Beamer and this coaching staff. Jared Brown, as I mentioned earlier, he is going to start for this team from day one. No questions asked. When that initial spring depth chart comes out in a couple of months, as the team gets ready for spring ball, Jared Brown, he will be one of the top guys at that wide receiver position. He is a proven playmaker. He can affect the game in a variety of different ways. And, in my opinion, he's got a competitive switch in him when it comes to how much he wants the football in his hands. So I think that this is a guy that can give you 600 plus receiving yards this next year. I think this is a guy that can make a few plays happen in the run game. He is going to open up the playbook a little bit more for Dowell Loggains than he would have been able to probably if they did not get a guy like Jared Brown. It is a fantastic starting point for South Carolina in this transfer portal cycle. You still got to get a couple more wide receivers. You definitely got to get a couple running backs. And you got to get a couple other guys at different positions. But it is a fantastic start for Shane Beamer and this staff in this cycle. Now, Jared Brown was not the only player to commit to South Carolina on Monday, as junior college defensive tackle Jerome Simmons also announced his pledge to South Carolina. So, what is Jerome going to bring to the field for South Carolina in the 2024 season? We'll touch on his game in a little bit more detail in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Now, when you're hiring employees for your small business, you want to have as many top-tier candidates as possible to interview and vet for those positions. And if you're in that kind of situation right now as a small business owner, you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team, both faster and for free. Hiring is easy when you have many quality candidates. It's so easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours when they utilize LinkedIn Jobs. And LinkedIn also knows that small business owners are wearing so many hats at one time that sometimes it's difficult to commit the time and or resources to hire the right people for your company. So, post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free and find the right candidate today. Terms and conditions do apply. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who made the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily watch on YouTube or your first listen wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. All right, let's talk about junior college defensive tackle Jerome Simmons, who announced his commitment to South Carolina on Monday morning. He was actually the first player to pledge to the Gamecocks on Monday. And when I talked about Simmons on our Monday show, because we kind of saw this coming, right? Multiple predictions were put in for Jerome to eventually end up at South Carolina from one of the main websites on the Columbia beat. And he was one of the official visitors this past weekend, and he's a South Carolina native. So everything seemed to line up perfectly for this to eventually play out in this manner. And when talking about Simmons, I discussed how he has your prototypical nose tackle type size. He's a guy that's listed at 6'3", 6'6", 330 pounds. He is a massive human being along the defensive line. But the thing is, Jerome is not your average nose tackle in terms of how he plays. Because when you think of a guy with that kind of size, you think of them as a space eater. Somebody that basically is going to help free up space for maybe an off-ball linebacker to go make a play in rush defense. But Simmons does not play that way. When watching back some of his film from his 2023 season at Highland Community College through Huddle.com, I saw a few different things with his game. One, he wants to dole out punishment when he gets his big old bear paws on an opposing running back. If you don't believe me, go check out the Huddle film for yourself. The first highlight is literally him suplexing the opposing team's running back. And by the way, the running back had fumbled the football in that play, so he didn't even have the football at that point. But yeah, Simmons still wanted to make sure that he was on the ground at the end of that play. He also moves quite well for a guy his size. He is always looking to make plays happen. He does not just stay stationary. He doesn't just engage a blocker and then pretty much just sit there the entire time. Simmons tries really hard to get off of his man once he figures out where the ball is going and tries to make a play for his team. And that's something that you love to see out of interior defensive linemen, because again, kind of like I talked about earlier with Jared Brown and him wanting the ball in every single play in a good way, you don't always see that with interior defensive linemen. When you're that large of a human being, it's really easy to want to just take plays off and not want to give 100% effort, even if it's a critical down in the drive. Jerome Simmons, based on the film I watched, he's not that kind of player. And for a guy like Travian Robertson, who, prided himself on the effort that he gave when he played here at South Carolina, now South Carolina's defensive line coach, I think that he's going to enjoy coaching Simmons because of that sort of mentality and attitude that he carries. And the other thing is this: Simmons is not just a big human being who can move well. He's also got some good technique in the sense that he does a great job of using his hands in rush defense to shed blocks or get himself away from a blocker and free himself up to be able to go and chase after the ball carrier. So, Simmons is going to primarily affect the game in rush defense. He's not going to be some unicorn pass rusher as a zero technique over the center. He's not going to be that for South Carolina, but he's got some really good quality traits that will translate to the SEC. There is one thing that Jerome does need to work on once he gets to Columbia, and that is playing with better leverage. The old saying goes that the low man always wins. And while I think that that is usually false to a certain degree, in this case, I do agree when it comes to the game of football, when it comes to play in the trenches. You can be as big as you want, as athletic as you want, but if you don't play with good technique in the SEC, you'll find out real quick and in a hurry just how much that is going to hold you back. Jerome Simmons, the good thing for him is learning how to play with leverage. It doesn't take like multiple years to figure that out. The only reason why some fans might be a bit concerned about that is because it might indicate that he has been leaning on his size and athleticism dating all the way back to his high school playing days. Because, quite frankly, more often than not, he's been the best guy on the football field, the best athlete on the football field. But the thing that I will say as a positive takeaway from this one thing he needs to improve on is if he can learn how to use better leverage when trying to attack a blocker, and pair that up with his good use of hands in rush defense in particular, Jerome Simmons could be a problem along the defensive line here at South Carolina. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say that he's going to just break out in the 2024 season. I view him right now as probably a rotational player, a guy that maybe takes a little while to sort of work himself into that rotation behind a guy like Tonka Hemingway and a Nick Barrett, who's already been in the program for several years and is a rising senior. But I do think in 2025, assuming that Simmons sticks around for that season, I could absolutely see him being a starter for this team, especially if South Carolina is playing more of a 3-3-5 or a 3-4 base defense. At that point, I think that Simmons, he can absolutely man down that nose tackle position in that kind of scheme. So, yes, he is a home state kid, and he certainly helps you out at a position of need in terms of depth and the archetype that he brings in terms of the size that he has. But Simmons is definitely more than that. He is a guy that, in my opinion, is going to help sooner rather than later when it comes to the defensive play for South Carolina this next season. Now, we've talked a lot about the football program over the past couple of shows, and we haven't discussed the basketball teams very much. But I wanted to change that on today's show because both teams are getting a decent break this week because of finals. And so I felt like that it was a good time to go and evaluate what they're doing well right now and what areas maybe they could improve upon. We'll touch on all that in just a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. As the weather gets colder, the NFL offers are staying hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers on FanDuel can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. Again, that is $150 if your team wins. In a couple of nights, we're going to have Thursday night football in the NFL between the Los Angeles Chargers and the Las Vegas Raiders. The money line for the Chargers is set at plus 130, and the money line for the Raiders is set at minus 154. So, seems like it's going to be a pretty close ball game here between these two AFC divisional foes. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. All right, let's talk about Don Staley and Lamont Paris's basketball teams now for just a few minutes to end today's show. And when discussing these teams, I was trying to think about how I wanted to set up this segment. I thought about, maybe giving them a grade to go along with the theme of final exams week for the athletes, but quite frankly, right now, both teams are doing so well that I thought it'd be a bit boring to just say they both get an A, and here's my reason why. So instead of doing that, I decided to go about it this way. We're going to talk about one area that both of these teams are acing right now, where they're passing the test with flying colors, and then another area where right now, maybe they would get a C, C-, and they need to improve a little bit. So we're going to start off with Dawn Staley and the women's basketball team for good reason. They're undefeated right now at 9-0. The unanimous number 1 ranked team in the country according to the Associated Press Top 25 poll. And the reason why right now is because of the area that, in my opinion, they are acing, and that is team togetherness. I know that sounds like a very generic answer to give here, but in my opinion, it is the reason why this team has done so well so far this season. I don't think even the most optimistic of Gamecock fans coming into this season would have expected this team to gel so well, so quickly, despite losing so many players from last year's Final Four squad. Losing a player like Aaliyah Boston, losing Zia Cook, losing a Bree Beal, losing a Letitia Mehier, a Victoria Saxton. I go on and on and on about all the experience, the championship medal that this roster had lost from this past year's team. And yet, these players, for the most part, when they go out there, they play like they've played together for 3 or 4 years already. And a lot of these players, some of them, it's their first time being full-time starters. Camila Cardoso, I mean, she's been a starter before, I believe, at Syracuse, but then she was pretty much the 6th person off the bench for Dawn Staley's team the past couple of years. Raven Johnson sort of split up the point guard roles this past year, and a lot of these other players, again, they were a part of the rotation, but they weren't the primary starters. And yet, despite that, they all are great at communicating with one another. They stick up for one another when there's a bit of a sticky situation that's sort of unfolding on the court. They have thoroughly impressed me, and I'm sure plenty of Gamecock fans, with how they have come together as a unit so quickly in non-conference play and against some good competition. 4 top 25 teams that they've already faced, and they've won each of those games, again, in my opinion, because of their team chemistry and camaraderie that they have with one another. Now, although they're number 1, although they're 9-0, this team certainly can improve in a couple of areas if we're going to nitpick. The one that I'm going to single out here is offensive ball security, essentially limiting turnovers. This basketball team has turned over the ball 56 times in their last 3 games away from the Colonial Life Arena. So maybe that was to be expected to a certain degree, but I did not think that they were going to turn over 56 different times in those 3 games against North Carolina, Duke, and Utah. The North Carolina game wasn't all too bad. They got things cleaned up relatively quickly after the first about 15 minutes or so. But against Duke, and especially against Utah, this team just really shot themselves in the foot. And that's not to take anything away from Utah or Duke. 2 solid teams. Obviously, Utah is probably like a top 8 seed in the NCAA tournament this coming March. And Duke is likely an NCAA tournament team as long as they get their act together in conference play. But a lot of those turnovers were because of self-inflicted mistakes. Offensive fouls being committed, basically just kind of plowing over a front court defender, maybe not running a screen at the right time. Raven Johnson trying to throw the ball to a particular person that doesn't see the ball coming. They're on different wavelengths, in essence. A lot of different reasons why those turnovers have piled up over the past couple games, again, away from home. But you've got to correct that, because at some point, if you're South Carolina, if you're Dawn Staley in this basketball team, you're going to face a team that is talented enough and good enough to capitalize off of your mistakes, off of your miscues, off of your turnovers, and convert them into enough points to where you lose them at the end of the day. You have to play like you are playing for March. It's December right now, so you can get away with this to a certain extent. You already have a couple of times. But you face the right team on the wrong day, it can spell trouble for this team if they do not get turnovers corrected. So, for Dawn Staley and the women's basketball team, they are acing team togetherness, but you have got to improve on offensive ball security. That has got to be better for the rest of the season. Now, switching things over to Lamont Paris and the men's basketball team. The area that they are acing so far is their creation and shot selection behind the three-point line. This is the best three-point shooting team that South Carolina has had in several seasons without a question. With Talon Cooper, Michi Johnson, Miles Studi, BJ Mack, and Stephen Clark all in the starting lineup for every game up to this point this season, it quite literally feels like that every single guy, even Stephen Clark, if he's got enough space, can all hit a three-point shot consistently. That is a problem for opposing defenses because they have to basically spread themselves thin. It draws out their front court defenders. And in modern basketball, that is the name of the game, offensively speaking. And for the Gamecocks, sure, they can run set plays that leaves Michi Johnson open for three, or leaves BJ Mack open for a three by fading back behind the three-point line. But they can also do a great job of making the extra pass, rotating the ball, swinging the ball around to the other side of the floor, finding an open man. They've done a great job of that this whole season. Now, the past couple games, some of their open shots they've gotten because of that have not fallen in, but that won't always be the case. As long as you're creating good shots, eventually, and I'm sure Lamont preaches the same thing, those shots are going to start falling for you, and it will pay you back more often than not. So, this men's basketball team, they're acing that part of their game right now. The area that needs improvement as far as the Gamecocks men's basketball team is concerned right now, in my opinion, is you've got to get better play in the front court outside of BJ Mack. Now, give credit to Stephen Clark. He has made some pretty good plays the past couple games against Clemson and also against East Carolina. Made some winning plays late against the Pirates, and I believe he scored 10 points against Clemson, which helped the Gamecocks keep it close down the stretch. So he's been playing better recently. But I don't know if that's always going to be the case when the Gamecocks get to SEC play and you start to play against much bigger front court players. I worry about Stephen Clark's ability to handle those kind of guys, defensively speaking, especially when they get to that point. BJ Mack, he's been a bit off shooting the basketball the past couple games. Again, I doubt that that's going to continue for very long. BJ Mack, he usually manages to create good looks for himself. He will get things figured out throughout the rest of non-conference play. But outside of BJ Mack, who's going to step up and help him out in the front court? Is it someone like a Colin Murray Boyles? The true freshman, look, he's only played, I think, 3 games now at this point since coming back from mononucleosis. And clearly, he's still trying to get his feet back under him. It's not going to be perfect at times. But Colin's got a ton of potential. And I think there's a pretty good reason why he's already seeing a ton of minutes under Lamont Paris's watch. I think Lamont recognizes the kind of ability and potential that Colin possesses. And in essence, this is a situation where there's no need to hold him back. He's going to have to learn sometimes being thrown to the fire pit, figuratively speaking. So put him out there. Let's see what he can do. That's what I think Lamont's doing with him right now. Maybe it's someone like him. Maybe Benjamin Bozeman's for Donk steps up. You know, he's been playing better this season when he has been on the floor. Now, he hasn't seen as much action the past couple of games. Not sure what the reason is for that. Maybe that changes over the next couple of weeks. Josh Gray, similar situation. I know that, again, he dealt with an illness early in the season. Not mononucleosis type of illness, but something that did kind of plague him for a couple of outings. But we haven't seen Josh Gray very much this season compared to what we saw from him last year in terms of playing time. So, again, I'm not sure what the deal is there. Maybe, small ball will be the name of the game for the Gamecocks throughout this entire season. And maybe Lamont, he just wants a little bit more time to try to maybe experiment with some different lineups, sort of see which guys mesh better with others. But the bottom line is, BJ Mack cannot be the only guy that is effective in your front court throughout this entire season. Eventually, especially again, when you start to face these SEC opponents in January and beyond, they're going to start to key in on that. And you're going to have somebody else step up alongside him in the front court so he does not take a bunch of double teams. So they do not just basically put all their focus and attention towards him. You've got to find somebody. 3-point shooting, it is great, and it can definitely bail you out. And I do think that there will be some games where 3-point shooting does bail this team out. But if you want to reach your full potential this season, if you're South Carolina men's basketball team, somebody else in that front court has got to be just as effective, at least on more nights than not, just like BJ Mack has been for them so far this year. So those are sort of my quote-unquote report cards for the women's basketball and men's basketball teams. And with that being said, that is going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I hope y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are y'all's thoughts on Jared Brown, South Carolina's first portal commit for this portal cycle, and what he's going to bring to the field for Shane Beamer and this football team? What are your thoughts on Jerome Simmons and what he can bring defensively for the Gamecocks? And lastly, what are your opinions on the women's and men's basketball teams and how they performed? What is one area that you think they've done well in, and one area where you think each team needs to improve? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watched today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. But as always, thank y'all once again for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.